Every part of our neurology that is not well integrated becomes a little self that wants to pretend it's you and stay away from its own disconnection. This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and today we're going to talk about how trauma perpetuates the egoic mode of the mind. So, in order to understand that, we don't have to go as far back as our early developmental years when the main core of the ego is formed, but we can take the example of any kink, any disconnection in our psychosomatic matrix. And so it could be in the throat, the heart, solar plexus. Those are typical problem areas. Now, when there is a little disconnection somewhere inside our nervous system, things become no longer feelable. Let's call it like that, right? So you experience trauma, you disconnect yourself from the feeling in that area of your body. And that area of your body becomes a kind of like a bubble unto itself. It becomes part of your subconscious. You're not really feeling it actively. Now, you can't reach in there with your mind, and maybe you don't even try, because to you it doesn't even exist. But it has a life of its own. And it's firing all the time based on memory, and it's trying to resolve itself. It's trying to reconnect itself. So what tends to happen, instead of that reconnection, because it feels very unpleasant to reconnect areas that are disconnected through trauma, is instead of reconnecting and going into our feeling and our somatics, we tend to go into our head. So that area keeps firing messages of often discomfort. And those messages go to our head, and they express themselves in the form of thoughts and beliefs and memories. And they have almost like a mind of their own. So the messages in our mind, the thoughts in our mind coming from a specific part of our trauma, a specific part of our neurology that is disconnected, are going to be self-consistent, right? They're going to be opinions about a certain event or a certain circumstance or certain types of people that we don't like, typically, things of that kind. We're going to be projecting all that stuff onto the outside world. And so long as the disconnection remains in our nervous system, that little self will continue to bubble up in the form of thoughts and beliefs and emotions as well. Now, you could think of that as a glass of sparkling water. So you can see the bubbles coming to the top, but the bubbles are coming from these invisible little spots at the bottom of the glass from which the bubbles are springing. And so the trauma is like that invisible little spot. You can't see it, but you can be sure that the little selves, especially the projections in our mind, the thoughts, are coming from there. So in order to go into know self, in order to do self-cultivation, self-realization, it's very difficult to do so if we're not tackling our somatics and we're not tackling our trauma, because trauma preserves the egoic mode of self very much cemented in our neurology. And there may be a lot of practices, and we may have to spend a lot of time dissolving those kinks in the hose, reconnecting with our somatics, with our somatic experience of emotion. And in doing so, we reconnect areas that had become disconnected through trauma. Once they are reconnected, once we start touching that part of our neurology, we start to get a read for what is happening in our body. And we start to disentangle the somatic sensations from the emotional tone that they produce, from the thoughts that they produce that pretend to be us. And by breaking apart that chain of events, we break apart the illusory self that these thoughts claim to be. In other words, there is an illusory self, we call it the ego. It's essentially made of identification with our thinking and disidentification from subconscious somatics. But if instead of believing our thoughts whenever we're having an unpleasant experience, we observe the thoughts, we follow them back and ask the question, who is thinking those thoughts? Then we go into our neurology and we realize that that which thinks the thoughts is nothing but a disassociative move away from feeling the feelings in the body, from which we had disconnected either through developmental trauma or through environmental trauma. So in other words, the whole path for spirituality, if we want to take it bottom up and sort of make it a wholesome and healthy thing for ourselves while we're on our way to higher states of consciousness or higher levels of consciousness, is a very mundane path of going back into the body and into the bodily sensations that we are either unable to feel or unwilling to feel, and to start becoming acquainted with a move that is more sort of downward into the body as opposed to up into our head, and to try to resolve things here on this level where problematic stories inhabit, but also where promises of spirituality solving things inhabit, which is also in the head. So things about entities, Atlantean origins, what happens after death, all that kind of stuff is stories in the head that are preventing us from diving deep into the body where things are actually resolved. When egoic selves are eliminated by breaking them apart into somatics, emotional discomfort, desire to disassociate from the body, and mental stories that claim to be us or that pretend to be a certain me that thinks that this shouldn't have happened, or I dislike that person, and all those kind of things. So yet again, another way to see this in a very pragmatic way that doesn't need to be mystified, and yet produces very mystical results and an amazing subjective experience once these things are cleaned out. As usual, if you've made it this far into the video, chances are you think this is useful content. It may also be useful to others, and the way to make it available is to share it, to share your comments in the comment section, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. And as usual, I'll be back with more pretty soon. And until then, cheerio and goodbye, and thanks for listening.